Welcome to Chapter 14, Oligopoly. The good news is, now that we know about perfect competition and monopolies, oligopolies should be pretty simple to comprehend, though you may not have heard the word oligopoly before. So let's dive into it. So again, after perfect competition and monopoly, oligopoly and monopolistic competition are the other two types of market structures we're going to talk about in this course. And they are forms of imperfect competition. So oligopoly is a little bit like monopoly, only it's not as strong, as opposed to one firm being in control of all the market. There are a small number of producers that control the market. Think of the market for soft drinks, Coke and Pepsi, or maybe the market for automobiles. There are a handful of automobile makers, at least in the U.S., of course, GM, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, but then also some of the other car makers from foreign markets, Nissan, Honda, etc. There aren't that many. So a producer in this industry is known as an oligopolist. So there is some market power in the fact that there are a few firms and they are able to control the industry a little bit. And here we go with the HHI, which is the, what is that called? It's an index that the government uses to sort of gauge whether these industries are oligopolies or not. I believe the cutoff is about 2000. It's so you could see here that internet service providers, SBC, Comcast, etc. There's so many of them. It's not necessarily an oligopoly. Automobiles is getting close. I guess I used that example before, but I guess it's not a true oligopoly. But aircraft makers, there's only two of them really. Boeing and Airbus making large aircrafts. PC operating systems, Microsoft, Linux. You could throw Apple into the mix. But those are some oligopolistic industries. So you can see it's a small concentration of firms with large market power and very similar products. So when you think of Boeing and Airbus or Coke and Pepsi, that's a duopoly. That's duo means two, of course. And with two firms in an industry, we get into game theory a little bit on, and this is why I love this chapter so much. But with only two firms in the industry, each realizes that if they produced as much as they possibly could, it would drive down market price. So each firm would like to realize the profits that would be higher if it limited production. So we will see how these two firms can limit production or not in this case. One instance is collusion, and that's when the two firms cooperate to raise each other's profits by limiting production or setting prices. The most famous example of this is OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. These are not exactly companies, but they're just countries. Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, so on and so forth. These countries don't necessarily like each other, but they all have a shared economic interest to maximize profits through the oil industry. So they collude. In America, collusion is pretty much illegal. So the reason they get around this is they don't do it in the U.S., of course. So that's the strongest form of collusion, which is a cartel, OPEC, as I just discussed. And there's also non-cooperative behavior, which is ignoring the effects of their actions, which means they just do whatever they want. And, we'll see what happens there. This kind of slide repeats the last one. Okay, so firms can decide to engage in quantity competition or price competition. With quantity competitions, they restrict how much they can produce. It's kind of easier to divvy up the market that way, pricing above marginal cost, earning some profits in the short and long run. So it is kind of easier to achieve this, even though it looks like collusion. They don't necessarily need a formal agreement to do this. If you and I are the only two sellers of a certain widget, and we both know if we limited our production, we could both get more profit, we might not even have to talk to each other and just kind of set our production at a half and half, and we may have an implied agreement without even coming to a formal one. And then there is price competition, and that's when they have firms produce perfect substitutes. They have sufficient capacity to satisfy demand up to price equals marginal cost. Each firm is compelled to undercut its rival's price until the price reaches marginal cost, which would be great for consumers, not good for the oligopolist, because that way price is no longer above marginal cost and marginal revenue. So let's look at the prisoner's dilemma, which I find fascinating. And that's when these two companies are in a situation of interdependence. And this is kind of the study of game theory. If I had to do it all over again, I might go into game theory. I find it just amazingly fascinating. So there's usually choices involved with game theory, and the reward received by the player or a company in the game, such as the profit, is known as your payoff. And we will about to see a payoff matrix in a two-player game. And this kind of shows us how companies can depend on each other. Not necessarily depend on them, but like your actions can affect the actions of another company and vice versa. So let's look at ADM and Ajinomoto. They are both the producers of something called lysine. And the choices you have here for both companies is either to produce 30 million pounds of it or 40 million pounds. As you can see here, if ADM produces 30 million pounds, it will either reap 180 million in profit or 115 million, depending on what Ajinomoto does. So same with 40 million pounds. If ADM produces that, it will either receive 200 million in profit or 160 million, depending on Ajinomoto's decision. As you can see, Ajinomoto has the same dilemma, so to speak. If they both produce 30 million pounds, and this is the market optimizing, the profit maximizing number, the book explained, 60 million total, they each would get $180 million in profit. But if one were to spot the opportunity, hey, if I produce 10 more million pounds, up to 40 million, say Ajinomoto did, this one time, while ADM was stuck at 30, Ajinomoto would make 200 million rather than an ADM would only make 150 million. Some of you may see where this is going. And also, if they both decided, hey, I'm going to produce 40 million, I want that market share, neither of them would get that profit. In fact, their profit would go down from 180 to $150 million. So it's within both of their interests to produce 30 million pounds. But often, in a market like this, that might not be the case for reasons we'll see in a minute or so. So the prisoner's dilemma kind of shows that each firm has an incentive to cheat to get that extra profit, but they're both worse off if they both cheat, when that's the prisoner's dilemma. And you'll see that again. This game's based on the fact that the player has an incentive to choose an action that benefits itself, but it will come at the other's expense. And if they both act that way, they will both be worse off rather than when they cooperated. Here we see two prisoners, Thelma and Louise, from the famous movie from when I was growing up, and you guys it was probably before you were born, Thelma and Louise. Say they are both apprehended, and the police give them some options. If they both don't confess, Thelma and Louise will each get a 5-year sentence. If they both confess, they'll each get a 15-year sentence. But if one confesses, and the other doesn't, the person who confesses gets 2 years, where the other gets 20 years for narking on her partner. As you can see, the Thelma and Louise would both be better off if they didn't confess, but they both have an incentive to cheat. In both instances, let's take Thelma for example. Is she better off confessing or not confessing? It looks like if she were, doesn't matter what Louise does. So say Louise doesn't confess. It looks like Thelma is better off to confess. Her situation's better off. She only gets 2 years instead of 5. If Louise confesses, Thelma is still better off. Thelma gets a 15-year sentence rather than a 20-year sentence. So in both instances, even though they're both better off if they both don't confess, in both options, Thelma has the better choice to confess. This is known as a dominant strategy. And that's when the player's best action, regardless of what the other player does, is what that action is. That dominant strategy is the best option, no matter what the other player does. And not every payoff matrix prisoner's dilemma has a dominant strategy. This one does, as does the one for ADM. And when you get to that point where both of them, say both Thelma and Louise, confessed, and they're both worse off than they would have been when they were if neither of them confessed, but they're better off if only one confessed and the other didn't. That's a non-cooperative equilibrium, or a Nash equilibrium, and that's when they both play the dominant strategy and they ignore the effects of their action on the payoffs of the others. The Nash equilibrium's named for the scientist, or the economist, I forget his first name, who was studied in that movie with Russell Crowe, A Beautiful Mind. Nash, I want to say Graham Nash, but that's not right. That's the musician. Anyway, so that the situation changes if there is a game that's played repeatedly. There could be some strategic behavior, sacrificing some short-run profit to get some influence in the future or some profit in the future. There's a couple strategies. One is a tit-for-tat strategy, and that is I will do whatever the other firm does in the previous round. So say you both kind of tacitly decide to collude and limit your production. As long as the other person doesn't limit the production, you will stay in that tacit collusion and make great profits. But if, say, ADM decides to raise production, and Gimoto will do the same, and then they're both worse off. It's kind of a punishment for raising production and to rate, and even though there's no formal agreement, that's kind of a tacit collusion. So you can see here, ADM, Ajinomoto, and this is the same as what we saw before. If we repeatedly play this game, if they start off limiting their production at $30 million, they each make some sweet $180 million profit. And that's if there's a tit-for-tat strategy. If they always cheat, ADM, if they both always cheat, they both are at this not as good $160 million profit. If one decides to always cheat and the other is a tit-for-tat strategy, the cheater will get some good $200 million profit in that first year, but every year after that, they will go down to this area because there was a tit-for-tat strategy. I'm going to do what you did, and so on and so forth. We're not going to go through this kink demand curve, so don't worry about that. You could see the ups and downs of oil cartels. Sometimes it works for OPEC, sometimes it doesn't. I find that kind of fascinating as well. The price of oil right now, incidentally, is, I think, just around $100 a barrel. So doing pretty well for OPEC there. So the government tries to, or does, and it doesn't just try, enacts antitrust policies to prevent oligopolistic industries from behaving like monopolies and colluding. Some of these firms have tacit collusion, but it is kind of hard to maintain due to a few things. Sometimes there's a price war. Sometimes oligopolists engage in product differentiation. I know a lot of car companies do that, where there's an attempt to convince buyers that its product is different than the products of the other firms. And sometimes it's possible for the industry to have price leadership. And this happens a lot in cars. GM is the one who sets the cars, or it has for many years, sets the price for the car industry. Every year GM would set its price. Ford, Chrysler, and the others would fall in line. I'm not so sure that's as true as it was in years past. And then oligopolists also have non-price competitions through advertising and other means. So we discussed that already, and I think that's really the highlights of Chapter 14. The good news is Chapter 15 and 16 aren't quite as long, so hopefully we're, as we get into the home stretch here, everything's clicking, and that's about it. All right, good luck, and thanks for listening along.